Right, welcome everybody to the first Wild Story Commons video interview. And we've got Lisa Schneidau, and Lisa Schneidau is trained as an ecologist, and she is a storyteller, author and environmentalist who's based in Devon. She works across the Southwest, telling stories to children and adults in schools, museums, festivals and nature reserves, and she's written two wonderful books on British folk tales. The first is Botanical Folk Tales, where you can find stories from the British Isles about all sorts of herbs and plants, sort of beautifully categorized and sorted and offered. And her new book, which maybe she'll tell us a bit more about, is Trees and Stories. So welcome, Lisa. Thank you for coming today. So I wanted to open with asking you a bit more about the two, I suppose, channels of work that you do, because you were trained as an ecologist and you came into storytelling. And I think for a lot of people, our ecological situation today is so horrendous, and it needs such kind of practical, urgent, radical physical action, that it's hard to think about something imaginative making a difference. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about, for you, how stories can help.
Yes, well, I'm investigating this. It feels a bit like a life's work, really, to work with story in this way. But I think with the environment, it's all about our connections with environment. And it's all about thinking about why we might value the non-human that's around us. Stories are inevitably human-centered. They always have been. They're about the human experience and everything involved in that. But of course, in our lives, we have such a complex web of interactions with the non-human, from the chair that I'm sitting on, where did the wood come from? Where did that tree grow? What was going on there? Right the way through to the food we eat, the air we breathe. It's all really fundamental stuff. And often that's something in a busy modern world that we forget. We don't really make those connections again. So if we can find a way back in with the nature in our environment, and if we can actually engage not only our logical brains, but also our emotional selves as well, so that we are making connections about what this might mean. We're not just going out into the field and we're saying, this meadow is gorgeous. This has got all of these species. Look, I can name these. It's brilliant. Now what do I do? It's all about why does this matter? And are we enjoying being there? And which bits are we particularly fascinated with? So I think if we can engage with story to help us with restoring our curiosity for the natural world, that can only be a good thing. And so it's like bunging these things in and as contributions and saying, okay, here's another way of looking at it. How about this?
That's fascinating. I love that idea of curiosity, you know, because I think, unless we have the kind of originating impulse to help us to get rid of our sort of lens of jadedness, I think, and lens of sense that the only thing that matters is humanity, and kind of let that go. And stories can really prompt us to do that, can't they? They can kind of help us to get in, prompt us to get in. And another thing I really wanted to talk about was, I think for a lot of people, particularly a lot of people think of storytelling often for children, and often the stories that are presented for children, they make it very easy to have a conversation with an animal, for example, and there's that sort of the charge that's often led against stories, fantasy stories for children, of the anthropomorphism of the animal. So how can these stories have a serious conversation with an animal when, you know, you can go and have a chat with a fox in a jacket, and, you know, you can invite a hedgehog round for tea, and how can that help us to have a serious dialogue with something so deeply different to us, something so other. And so when I heard you speak at the George Ewart Evans Storytelling Centre, you were talking about the importance of really meeting an animal before you tell it in a story. And I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about that, because I'm fascinated by the idea, and also a bit about, you know, how the animals in stories can actually help us to understand the other that is the animal, and not be a kind of human method or message, if that makes any sense.
Yes, gosh. I've been on my own journey with anthropomorphism, and it's been quite a tricky one. When you train as a scientist, you have it drilled into you that the scientific method, that being able to use fact to prove or disprove a hypothesis, the language is already a turn off, isn't it? That is everything. That is the sacred thing. The fact is the sacred thing. The proof is the sacred thing. And imposing a human consciousness on something non-human, on animal or even plant, anthropomorphism is considered to be absolute no-no. You just don't go there unless you want to, you know, shoot your credibility into pieces. And we all had that drilled into us, anthropomorphism, no. And that's quite interesting, because all the way through my career, I have encountered a great deal of suspicion among trained ecologists and trained conservationists about story. These are people who are utterly dedicated to their craft and utterly dedicated to the cause of helping to protect the natural world. And yet there is a deep suspicion about the emotion in it, and particularly what might be considered as hippie or airy-fairy. That is just not credible. And there is a real effort to distance from the kind of sandal-wearing, beardy Gaia brigade, if you like, call it that. And that's a great shame. I mean, these people will be using the arts, and they will be experiencing the arts in their lives outside work. They'll be promoting arts on things like nature reserves, and yet talking about fairies, that's just too far. That's too far. And I've been on that journey myself. It took me a long time to actually reconcile within myself the kind of story world and the science world. I'm quite happy about that now. There's nothing wrong with different ways of looking at things and different ways of explaining things. And just because I might tell a story about a wicked dandelion spirit who causes no end of trouble for a ne'er-do-well who thinks he's got a good deal, you know, I can do that, but that doesn't in any way take away from the fact that that dandelion still has got, I don't know, 100 subspecies. That dandelion is a really important pollinator early in the season. That dandelion is one of our commonest wildflowers. That's part of a constituent of all kinds of wildlife habitats all over the country. It doesn't take away from the fact of that species, but it adds a richness, I think, to our story of that particular species or that particular habitat that is part of the human condition. I think if we just go with fact, that's fine, but it is denying all of those feelings and all of those curiosities we might have and all of those imaginative connections that make our lives so rich. So there's a very, very interesting seam of conversation in there. You can go way too far. You can take all kinds of views and all kinds of interpretations, and there's lots of different ways of looking at the world out there. But science and art sitting alongside, I think, is really important if we are to be fully human, rather than just machines that measure things. The practical stuff is really important. You know, out there right now, there is still habitat being destroyed. There are still wild places being destroyed. There are still people creating more of it. That's all physical stuff. But let's bring that heart back into the culture, I would say.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of, do you know David Abram?
Mm.
I love the way he talks about animism as a different kind of seeing. So the idea that, you know, we've trained ourselves to bring our imagination onto the page or onto the screen. So we know how to read a book and we know how to follow a story on the screen. It explodes for us in our imagination, but we don't know how to sit in a forest and let it explode through our imagination. We don't know how to read the trees in a way that we would read a book. So it's not so much, you know, thinking, oh, this tree has a spirit living inside it, and that's a fact. It's more just bringing your imagination as a new lens and then being able to open up differently. And I love that distinction, you know, because it's often animism is seen with the lens of science and therefore dismissed, but it's really, for me, it's a different lens. I think that's really interesting. But yeah,
I think that's a good way of saying it, because trees are a wonderful case in point, and I've talked about this in the new book, in Woodland Folk Tales, that what has a tree seen? A tree has a very, very different time scale and life cycle to us. A tree will see many generations of humans coming through, and we will go in the blink of an eye, but what has that tree seen? How has that tree experienced it? You can't help but anthropomorphize, but to cut the conversation down immediately is a shame. That's a tragedy, I think. Explore it, see where it goes.
Exactly, because it's kind of like, it's that area of meeting, isn't it? And obviously, you know, the area of meeting can go all the way to kind of Beatrix Potter, and then it can go, you know, sort of more back when you're just sitting with the tree and thinking with it and trying to think with it. And that whole area is such an important area where the different lenses meet, I think.
Very much.
Absolutely wonderful. Yeah, fantastic. So the last thing I wanted to ask you before we hear, you're going to tell us a story, I think. So the last thing I wanted to ask you was about time, really, because it feels to me today that we live in such frightening but also very specific time. You know, there's not really any time before that we have faced the destruction of the entire planet. I mean, maybe we, you know, if you think a long time ago, people believed in the possibility of the end of the world, but they didn't confront it with the science in the way that we can. And also that sense of human responsibility is a new thing. You know, you, in the old tales, you have this sense of the forest as being all encompassing, and the idea of you being able to meet monsters in the forest. And today it's us, we're the monsters, and we're destroying everything. So feels to me like our brains are having to make a massive shift. And I really like what Martin Shaw says, that there are no new stories, that all the stories have been told to some extent before. And another thing it feels to me is that we tell stories too quickly today. We're constantly making them up. You know, you can stream 1,000 different fantasies or stories on Netflix, but actually to really take time and sit with the stories and to look at the way that they've evolved, maybe it feels to me helps us to deal with this new time, but I'm not sure why. And very often you look at the traditional stories and you think, well, what do they really have to say today when our, you know, our gender politics are different, things are changing all around us. So yeah, I suppose that's my question. You work with traditional tales. Do you ever find a kind of tension between the ethics and politics of today and the traditional tales? How do you think these old tales can help us?
I think there is something about traditional story which all storytellers have, this dream that you will stumble across this ancient tale that contains just that nugget of wisdom that you need at any one time. You know that thing, that perfect story? And of course, the perfect story doesn't exist. In the same way as the perfect connection between human and non-human doesn't exist. Everything is got that sense of separation. I think traditional story brings the human experience to bear, and there is some grounding in that. There is some solace and some comfort in the fact that humans at other times have experienced similar motifs and similar things to us. And that story has come all the way through the generations and still meets us here. And of course, we will look at that with a different lens to use your language from earlier. We will see that through our lens of the spirit of the time. And we may really struggle with stories of princesses and stories of being rescued by a prince, or we may really struggle with stories of violence or stories of injustice that really clash with our own ethics of the time. But there is that thing in story, isn't there, exploring danger and being able to explore danger in the imagination rather than literally. And there's a few interesting stories that I've been working with lately that I'm going through a process. I don't know where that's going. I don't quite know where those stories are taking me. One of them is very much within the Norse pantheon, and it's going to Ragnarok. It's going to the end of the world. I'm working up a storytelling piece at the moment about Ash dieback, which is a tree pandemic. See what I did there? It is a tree pandemic that is going to leave only about 5% of the ash trees that we have at the moment. It's absolutely horrific. And in the Norse, we have this this world tree, Yggdrasil, at the center of everything. And it survives Ragnarok. It always was, it always is, it always will be. And yet, what shape will things look like after that? It is the absolute extreme that a story could ever be. And yet exploring how the different elements work within that is very interesting. So that for me is actually helping me cope with lockdown in a way, and it's helping me cope with the grief of the Ash dieback situation. And I hope eventually that the story piece might be helpful for others as well. So that's that. The other story is quite a it's quite a common trope in storytelling. You know, the Firebird, the Princess Vasilisa, the story in the Russian tales of the man who gets the Firebird's feather, and he is taken through a series of challenges by the king, and he has a horse of power, and the horse always says to him, whenever there's a new challenge, he says, "This is not the real trouble. The real trouble is yet to come. This is going to be tough, but here's how to deal with it, and this is not the real trouble." And it's only when your young lad has to jump into a vat of boiling water that the horse goes, "Oh, you know, this is a bit of trouble now. Here's how you deal with it. Do it. Just jump in." There is that thing of the spirit of the times being relentless, of so many challenges being hurled our way that we cannot help but kind of bounce back. We're a bit like weebles. We kind of put off balance, and then we have to try to come back, and oh, here's another thing, and here's another thing. It can be totally overwhelming. So I've just given you a couple of examples, I hope, of stories which they've got very interesting threads in which are utterly resonant with our times. And they may not match completely, but they talk to the heart and they talk to the spirit. These stories do things which are beyond explaining, I think. They have to be felt, and they have to be worked, and they have to be walked. And eventually, when you work with story, there is a strange combination of kind of fate and serendipity. You'll know all about this when you work with a story. Like, oh, how did that suddenly happen in my life? Or these things come through, or other things pop up that were directly relevant. So I'm giving you a very long-winded explanation of how I think story can help us in the current day, but I think it's a really important constituent of our culture and our emotional lives. I think it is a medicine too. So yes, it is this huge source of richness in things. And as far as nature's concerned, I do think we as storytellers have quite a responsibility here to do with the natural world. Stories are, of course, about humans, but there is the interaction with the non-human world in them all the time. And if we pursue that relationship with other and with the natural world, and if we investigate it, and if that then reflects in our storytelling, then we are actually helping to reconnect with the natural world through the story. No longer is the hero just going into the forest. What's that forest like? What season is it? What trees are there? Does it feel dangerous? Does it feel safe? Is there food there? Is there a wolf lurking in the trees? What are the sounds? What's going on there? And in investigating that wild place, we reconnect, we help the listener experience that reconnection as well. I think there's a lot we can do to help with connection with the natural world in all the stories we tell, not just to seek stories about wildlife.
That's wonderful, thank you. So it's such a rich response there. I'm fascinated by the idea of the story prompting curiosity, as you said at the beginning, but also a need, because actually I was, a parenting tweet yesterday about being in lockdown, and the kids are on the phones, and the father says, oh, it's a beautiful day outside. 2 minutes later, the kids are outside on the phones. And this sense that we are basically, the worry about young people, and that the screen time is so seductive that actually it's hard to pay attention. And also that, but it's really interesting, that sense of there isn't a need to pay attention really, because you feel like when you're outside in your garden, or if you're in a park, it's a sense of you're not on a quest, you're just there. So that sense that the story can give us of a need to notice is really, really interesting, isn't it? And I also love what you said about the Princess Vasilisa and the feather, and that I'd completely forgotten that horse and the wisdom of the horse when he says this is not the trouble. And another thing I've been noticing about my own responses to the coronavirus situation is that sense of your sense of danger kind of ratchets up, doesn't it? And your sense of, okay, it no longer feels, contrast to what I've just said, it no longer feels quite safe to go outside. But actually then I think for the mental well-being, you have to take down your anxiety generally and realize that, okay, if you wake up, you're still breathing, you're still healthy, your family's still healthy, then this is not the real trouble. The real trouble may be coming, and you have to kind of reassess what you should be anxious about, because otherwise we'll just all go crazy. So that sense, that the wisdom of that horse of saying, the trouble is to come, this is not the trouble, and just therefore in your life you're learning all these skills for when we do have to face what we're going to have to face. I think that's a really beautiful way of saying it, so thank you for bringing that horse into the conversation. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to ask you to tell us a story now, if that would be okay. I think you're going to tell us a story that I first heard a couple of weeks ago, is that right? Strange Times, which is a wonderful storytelling club that happens on a Friday evening. And you can find it on Facebook or social media if you're interested. And this story really struck me by being in some ways very traditional, and in other ways really unique. So I'd love to talk to you more about it, but over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So this story really came from, originally I heard this story from a storyteller called David Heathfield, who is in Exeter, who works an awful lot with teaching English as a foreign language and teaching foreign students. And this story actually comes from South Korea. And it's a story I hadn't really worked with for a while, but it came back because of the blackbirds in the garden here. So I live in a little town on Dartmoor, and last year I bought a little rundown house here and have been doing it up, and the garden has been an absolute tangle. And there's a particular patch of ivy that really needed clearing, but by the time we got around to clearing it, it was too late and the birds were already nesting. We said, right, we'll leave it, and I'm very, very glad we did, because we have a pair of blackbirds here who, I think they're on their third brood. They are formidable. There's teenage blackbirds lumping themselves around the garden, squawking for food at the moment. And it's just hilarious. But actually being with those blackbirds during lockdown in this little garden here, I mean, we've got the whole of the moor out there. We're very lucky to be where we are, but just these blackbirds, they've got such an attitude on them. They're rather special birds. And it brought to mind this story, and so the story came back. And you probably know this, Joe, but blackbirds have got 3 different kinds of song. There's the really familiar, beautiful, lyrical, rich song of the blackbird in full song. And that's a very resonant thing of the British spring and summer, the blackbird song. There is a funny little call that the blackbird makes, which is a kind of seep, seep. It's a really, really fine, high-pitched noise. And that's just a way of saying, I'm here. And the other species do it as well. The robin does it. And there is also the alarm call, which is the completely ridiculous, it's dusk, the sun's going down, it's dusk. And you're like, yeah, shut up, it's all right. And there's this clatter through the undergrowth. That's also blackbird. And those thoughts of blackbird take me into this story, which is rather beautiful. It is about a couple. And they are called Mr. and Mrs. Park. And Mr. and Mrs. Park were lucky enough to meet very young. They met when they were about 16. They married early. They lived together in great contentment in a little cottage by the side of a woodland. And they looked after one another. They helped one another all the way through life. As they changed and their lives changed, there they were together as a unit, helping each other through. There was a great deal of love there, but the only thing they didn't have was that they never had a child. And that was a sadness to them, but they got on with their fate and they got on with their lot, and they loved and they lived. And at the beginning of this story, we meet Mr. and Mrs. Park when they were really very old. And they were just at the point where both of them were getting so crocked up and finding daily life so difficult that they were struggling to help each other, let alone get on themselves. And yet still they carried on in this little cottage. And one morning, Mr. Park opened the door of the cottage out to the edge of the woods and the grass in front of it, and he saw something moving around on the grass, a black shape. And he moved towards it, and he could see that it was a blackbird. It was a blackbird that had one injured wing and one good wing that was flapping around everywhere. And the blackbird clearly saw that he was there. And the blackbird was quite quiet, and it let him pick it up in a blanket. And Mr. Park carried the blackbird inside, and he put it in a box, and he and Mrs. Park set about the rather messy business of nursing the blackbird back to health. They put a tiny splint on its wing, and they fed it worms, and they did all of those things. And after a few weeks, the blackbird's wing was healed. And the happy day came when Mr. Park took the box with the blackbird in it, and he took it outside, and he said, you can go. You're healthy, you're fit, you're mended, you can go. And the blackbird flew up to the first tree at the edge of that woodland and sat on the branch and started to sing. And Mr. Park watched the blackbird and listened to the song, and the blackbird sang, and then the blackbird flew. And the following day, Mr. Park came out of the cottage, and he was feeling a bit low. He was missing the blackbird. They'd been looking after the blackbird for such a long time. And there, on the branch of the tree at the edge of the woods, there was the blackbird. And the blackbird didn't sing its full song that morning. It just said that little seep, seep, as if to say, I'm here. Mr. Park looked up, and the blackbird flew back to the next tree into the woods, and then turned around and made its little call again. It was as if it was watching Mr. Park. It was as if it was waiting for Mr. Park to follow it. And so, with all of his creaky joints and aching bones, Mr. Park followed into the woods. And every time he stepped a few steps forward, the blackbird would fly back to the next tree and turn around and make its little call, seep. Mr. Park followed. Very gradually, over minutes and over hours, Mr. Park followed the blackbird into the depths of the woods. And he found himself clambering with great difficulty over boulders and through bracken and brambles tearing at his clothes. And he couldn't quite remember how long it had taken him to get to where they were going, but eventually they came to a clearing in the woods. The blackbird flew over the clearing. The blackbird landed on a tree the other side of the clearing, and then the blackbird started to sing its full song. And as Mr. Park came to the edge of that clearing, he could see that in the middle there was a boggy patch of land. There were tussocks of grass and sedge and rush, and there were all kinds of different things in that clearing, but in the centre there were some rocks. And in the middle of that rock, there seemed to be some kind of spring bubbling up from the rocks. And Mr. Park very carefully squelched his way through that bog, and he eventually got to the stones in the middle. And as the blackbird carried on singing, he thought to himself, I'm really thirsty. I think I'll try a bit of that water. And so he just reached down, picked up some water, and started to drink. As Mr. Park drank the water from the spring, he realised this was really good water. I mean, he hadn't drunk water from a spring in the forest for a long time, but this tasted really refreshing. And as it went down his throat and into his belly, it seemed to bring a coolness and a clearness of feeling to it. And so he scooped down and started to drink more and more. And as the blackbird sang and Mr. Park drank the water from the spring, he started to feel so much better. I mean, really better. The aching in his limbs started to disappear, and the creaking started to go, and he started to feel better than he'd felt in years. And he drank, and he drank, and the more he drank, the better he felt. Until he thought, well, I've had my fill now. I'm not thirsty anymore. And he looked up at the blackbird singing in the clearing, and he said, thank you. And the blackbird just carried on singing. And you know, Mr. Park turned from that clearing, and on his way back to the cottage, he didn't struggle to clamber over the boulders. He didn't struggle to step over the bramble. He got home in record time. And he went into his little cottage, and there was his dear wife, Mrs. Park, sitting there in her chair, all crocked up. And Mr. Park said, hello, dear. And she took one look at him and said, who are you? Get out! But it's me, it's your husband. And she got to her feet on her walking frame and managed to make her way over to look at him, and her sight was really quite bad. And she looked up into his face and she said, yes, it is you. But it's you exactly the same way you were when we met. What are you, all of 18 years old? Well, it wasn't long before Mr. Park was leading old Mrs. Park over those boulders and through those brambles and all the way back to that clearing in the woods with the spring in the middle, picking their way through all the vegetation until Mrs. Park was as comfortable as she could be, reaching down to the spring, scooping up the water and drinking. And as she drank, Mr. Park watched. And it was extraordinary. Her eyes seemed to come out of their sockets, and the wrinkles around her eyes started to smooth. Her brow became clear. Her hair changed from white to pepper grey to sleek black. And her limbs started to plump and fill out. And he watched as Mrs. Park became that elegant, poised young woman that he had first fallen in love with all those years ago. Until eventually he said, I think that's enough water now. I think you must be about the same age as me. And they looked up and they looked into each other's eyes. And it wasn't long before they were almost skipping back through the woodland to their little cottage, where they closed the door of the cottage, and they didn't come back out again for quite some time, because they had remembered what it was like to be young and in love. Well, so much, so good a story. A couple of days later, their neighbour knocked on the door. Now, their neighbour's name was Mr. Who. Mr. Who, well, he was a bit of a kettle of fish, that one. He must have been in his 50s, but if you ever talked to him, you would think Mr. Who had never had a decent day in his entire life. He complained about everything. Nothing in his life was good. Nothing in his life had ever been good. And as you can imagine, he lived on his own. So he knocked on the door for a cup of tea, as he did every so often. And when Mr. and Mrs. Park answered the door, "What's happened to you?" he said. "Come in, we'll explain." And they gave him a cup of tea, and they told him the whole story. Except they didn't quite finish, because about 2/3 of the way through that story, Mr. Who's teacup went flying, and he was out of the door before they could finish. He was out of the door and out into the woods and out to that clearing. Mr. Park looked at Mrs. Park. "Well, we'll see what happens," they said. "We'll see what happens. We'll just wait for him to come back." And they waited. And they waited. They waited all day, and it got to the point where the sun was getting low in the sky, and they said, "Well, he hasn't come back. We really ought to go and find him. We shouldn't leave him out in the woods on his own at night." And so they made their way through the woods to the clearing where the spring was. And they got to the edge of that clearing, and there was the blackbird. There was the blackbird over the other side, sitting on the branch, singing in full song. There was nobody else in the clearing. There was no sign of Mr. Who anywhere. All there was, on the rocks by the spring, was a bundle of old clothes. And Mr. and Mrs. Park went over to the bundle of clothes and said, "Well, we don't understand." And then Mrs. Park saw something move. And she went to the clothes and she picked up the collar of one of the shirts that was there. And she heard the sound of a little mewling baby. And she picked up the bundle and pulled back the cloth, and there was a screwed up little face of a newborn. "Mr. Who, what have you done?" But Mrs. Park just looked down and said, "This is the baby we never had. Here is a little one we can really look after." And as the blackbird sang, they turned around and they made their way back to their little cottage, where they closed the door with their new baby and got on with their lives in love and in companionship. Now, whether Mr. Who was any different when he grew up this time because of the care of Mr. and Mrs. Park, this story doesn't say, but I'll have to leave that one to your imagination.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was absolutely wonderful. It was lovely to hear it again and to hear again all the things that really struck me the first time. And yeah, I love the fact that it really, you know, we have this trope in our vision, I suppose, in our senses, in our awareness of the world, that children are cute and adorable or whatever, and then when you get to adults, you know, they're either good or they're bad, and if they've become bad, there's not much to be done, particularly in fairy tales. And I love the fact that it really, you have this kind of grumpy neighbor, and then suddenly he's this innocent babe, and the fairy tale really allows that. It allows that transformation, the story. And so many times, one of the things that really struck me about it is that so many times when I'm teaching folk tales, my students say, we're not okay with the two older brothers or sisters having a terrible fate just because they don't manage to do the task. We're not okay with the mean neighbor getting punished because the mean neighbor doesn't know the right thing to do. You know, what, we're not okay with the people getting hung because they didn't, you know, that they're younger. So that sense of the fairy tales or the folk tales that we often come down to us, with, I suppose, the binary, that sense that you're, particularly when you're an adult or when you're old enough to go on a quest, you then become either successful or a failure. And, you know, distilling that down, I suppose you're either good or evil. So I'm really interested in the way that the story challenges that and the way that the end undercuts it, and provides, I suppose, a second chance in a really cyclical way, it seems to me. So I wondered if you could say something about the end of the story and the way the flavour feels to you.
Yes, to me, it is a story all about hope and redemption and renewal, of course. The folklore of the blackbird, certainly the folklore of the blackbird in the West and in Britain, is all about a bird that is on the edge of conscious and unconscious, or this world and the other. It's a kind of gateway. And there's something wonderful about the blackbird in this story to me that is almost the catalyst for that change to happen, just by a change in their lives, a change in the routine of their lives, and the opportunity to care and the opportunity to put right. And the opportunity to put right is sometimes conscious and it's sometimes unconscious. Things happen randomly. The binary is an interesting one because also in story there is the binary between having children and not having children, being blessed and being cursed. And yet life is just life, and these things happen. And so I like the story because it's not too judgmental either in that respect. It's just about what occurs and the opportunity that occurs and the things that unfold out of that. But yes, I do love that bit at the end, thinking about Mr. Who, and about how he might have another chance too, because he's clearly not happy. That's rather lovely. So yeah, it's a good little story all round. It's a very heartwarming story.
It is. And I really like your point about life being just life, you know, and that sense of that the first time round, they don't have children. It's not the way they see it is not a curse. The way they see it is just life. You know, it reminds me of a problem I often have with 19th century literature when something goes wrong. And often Thomas Hardy's a wonderful poet, but I find his books really difficult because when something goes wrong, that's it. You know, you're damned for your entire life, and the entire life is the unfolding of this fatal flaw or this tragic accident, and it, you just watch it and you think, well, but there are also good things in their lives. Maybe we could focus on that. And I love the way that, you know, this story really focuses on kind of like what we were saying about the horse and the trouble. It focuses on this isn't the biggest trouble, that they're home, they have a home, they love each other, and that's where their vision is, that's where their attention is. And I wanted to ask you a bit more also about the nature of home in the story, and because it's not, I get another interesting thing about it is it's not a hero quest story. It's not a story about going out, meeting monsters and then coming back. It's not that hero's quest. It's a story, for me, it's a story about being with home and actually seeing your home, attending to your home, allowing your home to become a healing space so that then you can kind of bring in somebody who needs healing and heal them from the home, and then receiving gifts because you've paid that attention. And I think that's a real medicine for our time, that sense that actually it's paying attention to the home and to our kinships around our home that is the medicine that we need, not so much going out and slaughtering monsters. So yes, for you, how does home, is it a story about home, do you think?
I think it is, in a sense of that contentment with Mr. and Mrs. Park, and they are very specifically Mr. and Mrs. Park. You know, they are a couple. They don't have their own names, and the home. There are so many folk tales all over the world that has a cottage at the edge of the woods, or a shack at the edge of the woods, or a castle at the edge of the woods. It doesn't matter how big or small or grand or tiny your home is. The fact is that it is at the edge place. It's not in absolute security. It is at the edge of danger. It is at the edge of richness. It's at the edge of the unknown. But it's there, and it's haven, and it's hearth. And I would far rather have a home in that place than a home somewhere that was gated and protected and never had any opportunity to be open to new things. So I think there's something quite important there as well, even though the hearth is a glorious thing and needs celebrating a lot more. And perhaps we've all learned something about that during lockdown, being at home so much and getting to know that space and working with that space in a way that perhaps we haven't been able to. I think there's something about always being open to the new. And for the blackbird as well, you know, a blackbird that has injured its wing is going to die if it's not found. But having someone coming and pick you up is also terrifying. How do you know it's not a predator? How do you... I did a bit of work when I was revisiting the story about what the blackbird would have done, and it probably wouldn't have alarm called. It would have just been terrified. And yet it was lucky. It was Mr. Park. And, you know, that's a great and healing thing, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. It makes me think of this idea of home. I love your point about home being on a kind of liminal space, you know, the fairy tale, the folktale homes are the powerful ones. Like Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother's home is the one on the edge of the woods. Or it makes me think of, I can't remember which philosopher it is, but talking about the idea of home as a conversation and home building as a conversation, because originally that sense of building a home is a sense, should be a sense, not of destroying wilderness, but of having a conversation with it. And where we set our home, where we make our habitat, should be a place, it should be a process of conversation with what's around us. And I think that sense of nowadays, it's very often a process of deafness or a process of blocking out. We try and build our four walls, and we try and you know, make these swathes of perfect weed-killed lawns. So we move away the wilderness that could possibly come and converse with us. So I think that sense of home as conversation on the edge in folklore is fascinating, and that story really explores that, doesn't it?
It does. That's a really lovely way of putting it. It's all to do with that flow and that play with what's outside. Yeah, lovely.
Absolutely, yeah, wonderful. And I love the way that you bring the blackbird and the call of the blackbird in. Yeah, could you just finish telling us something more about the call of the blackbird, because that seems so central to the story, and the three different calls, and actually the fact that you give us this information before you start telling the story feels really important to the listening of the story, I think.
Well, you'll have noticed at the beginning of the story, I was anthropomorphization central, wasn't I? Here's what the blackbird's saying. This is what I think the blackbird's saying. I could have said to you, actually, this call is made as an evolutionary advantage to be able to gain a mate and to keep a territory, but I didn't. So I think that sound of the blackbird in story, perhaps we pay so much attention to the images in our head that we don't use sound as much as we could, and describing sound is something that I'm investigating. It needs a lot more work, because it's one of those things where sparse words tell a great deal, and to cast a soundscape in a listener's head is quite an interesting notion. But we all know that song of Blackbird, and to a certain extent, we probably all have some idea of that attitude of Blackbird as well. And there we start to see Blackbird as an actual character and not just a bird. So it is a living thing with its own needs and its own story and its own thing. That's really important in that story. It's not just a bird in a tree. Exploring that. And that blackbird may be very different depending on the listener as well. If it had been a crow, or if it had been a magpie, would have been a really different story. But it wasn't. It wasn't.
Absolutely. And it's a telling of story that really allows the complexity of the blackbird. I think it's Kate Bernheimer who talks about the substitutionality of fairy tales, that very often, particularly the ones that we take straight off the page, it feels like things can be switched around. So it feels like an old man, a beggar by the side of the road, could be substituted for a frog, could be substituted for an old woman, could be and that sense of, once you allow the stories to open up, you realize that it's not, that actually the creature or the person is really embedded within the network of story. And I love the way you do that with the sound of the blackbird. So really kind of allowing it to expand out. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. This has been fascinating.
That's a
pleasure. So yes, thank you so much. And do you want to, before we finish, did you want to tell us a little bit about your new book?
Yes, love to, and thank you for that. It's so Botanical Folk Tales, that came out a couple of years ago, was really a way of exploring folktale of British plants, and trying to also provide a resource of those for people to be able to tell them, to have them in one place. And I've continued that theme with woodland folk tales. So there is a series of folk tales from different parts of Britain and Ireland, all about woodland. Some of them about particular trees, some of them, quite a lot of them, about our cultural and historical relationship with woodlands. So there's a couple of stories in there, for example, about people who go mad and wild in the woods and leave home completely, thinking back to home. There's all kinds of different experiences of what the woods are, as place of danger, as place of resource, as place of solace, as place of protection even. So that, hopefully, Woodland Folk Tales of Britain and Ireland, is coming out in September, from the History Press. We've been a bit delayed because of furlough, but we're getting there now. So yes, I hope that's going to be another useful resource, but there's plenty of stories in there to tell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I can't wait until it comes out. All right. Thank you, Lisa. Have a wonderful day.
Have a good day. Thank you very much for inviting me along.